Welcome to MojoPlays, and today we're counting down our picks for the most frustrating, poorly designed, and outright bad dungeons from the Legend of Zelda franchise. To be clear, we already have a video of the hardest temples in each game. This is not the same thing, though there will be some overlap. We also won't be including any randomly generated dungeons. Before we get started, we post new videos all week long, so be sure to subscribe to MojoPlays and ring that bell to be notified about our latest videos. Death Mountain, The Legend of Zelda. Before it became associated with the Gorons, Death Mountain was synonymous with its namesake for Zelda fans. This absurdly convoluted dungeon is frustrating on a number of levels. It's filled with the most difficult enemies in the game. Despite featuring 16 locked doors, there's only 4 keys inside, so if you didn't get the magical key, you're gonna have a bad time. Likewise, it's also fairly easy to miss the silver arrows, which are the only thing that could beat Ganon at the end of it. Death Mountain's obtuse design makes it not only difficult, but also straight up terrible. Great Palace, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. The only thing great about this palace is the amount of annoyance it's caused gamers over the years, and maybe its theme music. Zelda 2 in general is a miserable experience for many players, and its final dungeon cranks things up even further. The Great Palace is not only a veritable maze filled with dead ends, lava, and obnoxious enemies, but its ending has you face 2 of the franchise's toughest bosses back to back. First, the Thunderbird, which is basically invincible unless you get the specific spell that works on it. Then you have to fight a mirror match against Dark Link. Granted, your doppelganger is easy to cheese once you know how, but it's hard to stumble onto it without a guide. Ice Palace, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. Although the blue mail you acquire in the Ice Palace is nice to have, I mean, who doesn't love reducing your damage by half? The rest of the dungeon is an exercise in frustration. The vast majority of the floor is slippery, which makes something as simple as walking more difficult. It's highly likely that you'll slip and fall between floors, leading to plenty of backtracking through a confusing mess of a dungeon. Much like shoveling snow or de-icing your stairs, the Ice Palace is less Winter Wonderland and more of an annoying chore. Eagle's Tower, The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. Although this oft-remade Zelda title is generally pretty easy and fun, Eagle's Tower is arguably a low point despite how tall it is. The dungeon's main mechanic revolves around breaking 4 pillars with a large ball. Some of the puzzles involving it are genuinely good, but after a while, it can be irritating to throw the ball over a wall and backtrack through half the dungeon just to pick it up again. The dungeon boss is also lackluster. The evil eagle that gives the tower its name is not defeated with the dungeon's item, the Mirror Shield. Instead, you attack it with your sword. We'll grant that the boss fight's presentation is novel, but ultimately, Eagle's Tower simply doesn't live up to its potential. Inside Jabu-Jabu's belly, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Yeah, that's right. Worse than the Water Temple. Link's sojourn in the literal belly of a beast is an annoying slog of an experience. Whether Jabu-Jabu's belly makes your stomach turn at the gross, fleshy aesthetic or not, there's no denying how irritating it is to navigate. Keeping track of which fleshy columns were blocking which hallway is tricky, as is keeping Princess Ruto, whom you're escorting, from falling down a hole or into water. You're a Zora, why can't you swim? Not to mention the jellyfish, all of which can stun you with electricity. Plus, it has one of the most difficult mini-bosses in Zelda history. Between all the backtracking, annoying enemies, and escort mission, inside Jabu-Jabu's belly is a tough pill to swallow. Great Bay Temple, The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask. Another water dungeon, the Great Bay Temple has a confusing central mechanic involving redirecting water. The strong currents throughout can often send you in a direction you didn't want to go, which leads to more backtracking and more annoyance. While everything is color-coded to make it easier in theory, in practice, most players still get lost. With the 3-day time limit in Majoras Mask, there's the added stress of a deadline if you can't finish in time. It's a real hassle, particularly if you're looking for all the stray fairies. The mini-bosses and boss are obnoxious too, with the latter being particularly frustrating. Our advice, use a walkthrough and cheese that stupid fish boss as much as possible. Jabu-Jabu's Belly, The Legend of Zelda, Oracle of Ages. Guess who's back? Why are we still going inside this thing? The electric enemies that made the inside of Jabu-Jabu annoying have returned, but this version of the dungeon has some new headaches. Like the water temple in Ocarina of Time, you must raise and lower water levels and navigate with a hook shot, or switch hook. However, given that it's a 2D Zelda game, figuring out the water levels is even more difficult. Chances are you'll be backtracking a lot, and considering you'll be doing so through spikes and annoying enemies, Jabu-Jabu's Belly is once again a dungeon that turns our stomach. Sword and Shield Maze, The Legend of Zelda, Oracle of Seasons. Mazes are as well known for their simplicity as rocket science, so not at all. This particular maze is a fire and ice temple in one. The frigid shield portion is filled with those oh-so-pesky slippery floors. Meanwhile, the fiery sword floors are loaded with lava pits and a ton of enemies that will throw fire at you. One of these extremes would be bad enough, but both at the same time is truly the worst of both worlds. The only thing easier than getting lost in the sword and shield maze is getting frustrated by the whole experience. Forsaken Fortress, The Legend of Zelda, The Wind Waker. You know what everyone loves? Mandatory stealth sections. Clearly someone at Nintendo didn't get the memo, because the first real dungeon in this game forces Link to give up his newly acquired sword to sneak around in barrels. The Forsaken Fortress's wide open yet somehow confusing design certainly doesn't help, nor does the fact that you have to revisit the area a second time later in the game. Absence doesn't make our hearts grow fonder either. The second time around has a couple of decent boss fights, but the rest of the layout hasn't changed enough for it to be any less tedious. The Forsaken Fortress kills the momentum of the game not once, but twice. That's enough for us to forsake it entirely. Cave of No Return, The Legend of Zelda, Four Swords Adventures. Even some of the worst dungeons have some good things about them, like their atmosphere, mechanics, or theme music. The Cave of No Return isn't especially difficult or frustrating, though the fact that it's set entirely in darkness is pretty annoying. No, the Cave of No Return is just boring. It's an early tutorial dungeon meant to teach you how to control 4 links to work together to solve puzzles. Beyond that, there's not much to it. The Zelda franchise has had many introductory dungeons, but the Cave of No Return is one we'd rather not return to. Fortress of Winds, The Legend of Zelda, The Minish Cap. Can an ancient temple have false advertising? Because the Fortress of Winds doesn't have any wind in it. Instead, what we get is a bog-standard dungeon whose central item gimmick involves digging, which kind of feels like the opposite of wind. Fortress of Winds is also fairly easy to get lost in, and the many moving portions make getting through it quickly more difficult. Even the boss is the same head and 2 disembodied hands boss we've seen a million times before in Nintendo games. While Fortress of Winds isn't the worst dungeon, it simply doesn't do as many new or interesting things compared to other dungeons in the Minish Cap. Palace of Twilight, The Legend of Zelda, Twilight Princess. Linearity in dungeon design is one thing, but the Palace of Twilight is basically 2 straight lines. The majority of this dungeon boils down to retrieving a pair of light orbs from the end of several long hallways. The boss fight is something of a letdown too, since Zant, the fake-out big bad of the game, merely repeats the patterns of bosses seen earlier in the game. Don't get us wrong, the atmosphere and eerie environment of the Palace of Twilight is fantastic, but when most of the dungeon involves doing the same fetch quest twice in a row, followed by what's basically a boss rush, the Palace of Twilight just can't stack up to the wild creativity of the rest of Twilight Princess. Temple of the Ocean King, The Legend of Zelda, Phantom Hourglass. Imagine if Nintendo decided to include all the worst things about temples, like forced stealth sections, time limits, and returning multiple times into one temple. Well, you don't have to imagine, because Temple of the Ocean King is unfortunately real. You can only survive so long inside the temple, giving you a strict time limit which is drained by phantoms. So to keep your time, you'll want to avoid phantoms as much as possible. To beat Phantom Hourglass, you'll have to return to this temple no less than 4 times, and having to redo the puzzles becomes a chore after the second. It's the mark of a terrible temple that this one drags down its entire game. Tower of Spirits, The Legend of Zelda Spirit Tracks. Another central dungeon like its predecessor, the Tower of Spirits is an improvement in some ways over Temple of the Ocean King. For one, you don't need to repeat sections you've already completed. Being able to possess phantoms is also pretty cool. However, the Tower of Spirits is a whopping 30 floors long, and its later levels include some surprisingly complex puzzles that can be frustrating to complete. By the time we're done with it, we just wish the Tower of Spirits would live up to the title of its game and make tracks. Earth Temple, The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Despite often being called a black sheep among Zelda games for its awkward control scheme, Skyward Sword has some really solid temples. Arguably the weakest of them is the Earth Temple, a fire temple by another name. The Earth Temple is extremely short and only has about 3 rooms in total. Rolling around on a boulder is pretty fun, and the boss is a decent challenge. However, the dungeon item is just bombs, which doesn't change up gameplay that much. And did anyone else struggle with finding that stupid crack in the wall? Skyward Sword has some of the most inventive dungeons in Zelda history, so yet another fire temple just can't hold a candle to the rest. Dark Palace, The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds. This is one of those love it or hate it temples, and we are not fans. To be fair, this version of Dark Palace is an improvement over its counterpart from A Link to the Past. It makes the lantern, often derided as a useless item, absolutely essential. Its sporadic use of color and a challenging boss fight are also high points. However, the ever-present darkness makes everything from puzzles to enemies to finding your way around that much more difficult. If Dark Palace was a shot in the dark, then it would definitely be a miss. Hinox Mine, The Legend of Zelda Triforce Heroes. Minecart levels can be an exercise in frustration, and this Zelda take on it is no exception. Hinox Mine sees your trio of links forced to go round and round on carts. You open up new paths by throwing bombs and shooting switches with arrows. Timing is everything, and hitting small targets while in motion isn't the easiest thing in the world. If you miss, you'll have to wait for your chance again, and if you miss more than once, you're gonna start hating this dungeon really quick. Plus, these difficulties are only compounded when you're playing co-op. A gold mine, this dungeon is not. Divine Beast Vah Naboris, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild.
Don't let us down, Link.
Traditional temples went out the window in Breath of the Wild in favor of divine beasts. While most of them are fairly easy and straightforward, Vah Naboris has a reputation for frustration. To progress, you must rotate the cylinder of its body to connect electrical currents. This isn't exactly the most intuitive puzzle for many and led to plenty of head scratching over how to solve it. But players' ire only increased when we faced the boss, Thunder Blight Ganon. Not only is this thing wicked fast, it'll also stun you if you don't have shock-resistant potions or clothing. Even if you came prepared, Thunder Blight remains one of the toughest bosses in the game. Vah Naboris overall is like desert sand, very irritating. Fire Temple, The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom.
Here I go! Let's go!
Tragically, Nintendo didn't learn their lesson about minecart levels after Hinox's mine. Link and his companion Unibo are supposed to travel along several mine tracks throughout this large open temple to hit several gongs to unlock the way to the boss. Granted, the boss is straightforward as it's a fire version of a long-standing spider boss, but the rest of the temple can be confusing and frustrating to navigate. Perhaps that's why many people just decide to climb the walls to reach the gongs or craft vehicles to bypass the intended routes entirely. When players find it easier to skip large sections of a temple, maybe it doesn't have the best design. Nulls Body, The Legend of Zelda: Echoes of Wisdom. While the idea of setting a dungeon inside a living being is great in theory, it's rarely led to a good dungeon. See Jabu-Jabu. Set within the final villain Null, Nulls Body does offer something new by having Link fight alongside Zelda. However, fighting is primarily all you do together, as the puzzles aren't very involved and Link's AI makes us yell at our screams sometimes. Null itself makes for a decent boss fight, with echoes of the previous bosses returning. However, Nulls Body is an incredibly short dungeon overall. It feels like they could have done so much more with Link and Zelda working together. In other words, this temple doesn't make us mad, just disappointed. Is there a Zelda dungeon from these games you think was worse than our picks? Be sure to share your most hated dungeons in the comments. Be sure to check out these other fun clips from MojoPlays, and if you enjoy our content, leave us a like, comment on the video, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next time.